Saturday, October 6th, 2018, Monaco 64, home of alternative economics and contrarian views. Today I'm going to talk about how I think the bond market thermostat is being reactivated, and I'll explain that later. Before that, I'd like to thank all the new subscribers, all the existing subscribers for being part of this Monaco 64 community, if you want to call that, for contributing through donations, through using the Monaco 64 store. There's really interesting merchandise there, and the Fed t-shirts, Billy mugs, stickers, and it helps the channel. It helps me keep making the channel bigger, doing more content, and spending more and more time creating content. Also, a lot of the viewers ask me many times where they can buy precious metals. Now I've got a promo code with goldinvestments.co.uk. You can get 0.5% discount if you buy bullion bars or coins from there. They ship abroad as well, but probably not as cheap as your local bullion dealer. So this would be more for the UK viewers. But feel free to go have a look, goldinvestments.co.uk, and use Monaco 64 promo code. So the bond market, yes, was a big week for the bond market. Why? Well, because the yields rose very sharply. We closed at 323 on the 10-year yield yesterday. A week started around 304, 305. It was the big jump for the bond markets. Many of you might not know, I worked in the City of London for over 20 years, and my specialty was bond markets and interest rates. And I was a broker for institutional clients, for the big banks, for pension funds, mutual funds, hedge funds, corporate treasuries. So, and that's the market I covered the most. We, of course, did look at other markets because, markets don't trade in isolation. So why is the bond market so important? You might be asking. We've got unemployment rate at the lowest in 49 years. We've got the economy growing really well. What are you worried about? Well, I'm worried about the debt and and interest rates. And why is that? Well, interest rates or the yields going higher is the cost of money. The Treasury 10-year yield is the cost of money for the U.S. government. The U.S. government is the safest borrower in the United States and probably the world, because it can just pay off its debt by issuing more debt. Very few people can do that. And that's why if the interest rate for the U.S. treasuries are spiking like this, it's a problem for everyone, for all other borrowers, corporate borrowers, private borrowers like you and me. If you borrow, hopefully you're not borrowing too much. One thing I wanted to talk about before I go further, and about the thermostat, the bond market thermostat. And what do I mean by that? Well, when you drive your car, let's say, at least me in the summer, I put the air conditioning on and it's really hot, and I put it really high, and then it gets a bit too cold, and I turn it back down and try to make it the right temperature. I know, and vice versa in the winter as well. It's too cold, you turn it way up when you get in the car, and you get too hot and you turn it down. The bond markets used to work like that with the equity markets and other markets and the economy. And I remember it very well in when I started out in the late 80s, early 90s, mid 90s, up until the late 90s probably. Whenever you had economic numbers that were very strong and higher than expected by the markets, what used to happen is that the stock market used to come off a little bit, and the bond markets also used to come off, and interest rates would rise. Why? Well, because that was the function of the markets, to kind of keep things on an even keel. Not too much, credit, just enough. And then if you had a negative economic news, you actually would see maybe the stock market do fairly well. You'd see bond yields drop, people buy bonds, and that's what we used to see. But ever since, I think I have to go back to Ben Bernanke in a speech he made in 2002. I think it was in Japan. And he said that and he wasn't Fed chairman at the time, but he became famous for that helicopter money speech. He said, the Fed can always, print as much money as it wants to keep interest rates low and to keep the financial markets, going. Yeah, Ben Bernanke basically said the Fed has got your back, and I think that was the time, 2002, when we started seeing that thermostat being removed, and we kept seeing bond markets doing well, stock markets doing well, no problem, and even Alan Greenspan came out and made it seem like he didn't know what was going on, or even Ben Bernanke. They were talking about the conundrum, that interest rates kept going lower even though the economy was booming. And then you had the '08 crisis, and then they really turned off the thermostat. Well, not even turned off, they just got rid of the thermostat. And you had years, from '08 to 2016 of zero interest rates, money printing, not only from the Fed, from all other central banks. And why am I saying now that I think the thermostat is being reactivated? While looking at the bond markets, looking at the interest rates, looking at all the debt, I think we are in at a juncture which is very dangerous. It's up to you, the viewer, to decide whether we are, the U.S. economy, the world economy is the plain sailing, nice, smooth, not rough seas, sunny, just enough wind, or if we are a runaway train. I personally think I'm leaning more towards the runaway train scenario. I'm off the train. You might say, oh, you might miss the train. Of course, but there's always more trains coming to the train station. And I'd rather be off the train right now. You might not want to. This is just my opinion. This is not advice. So now let's look at the debt. And the thermostat also has to do with the punch bowl, right? That's a term coined by William McChesney Martin. He was an ex-Fed chairman in the 60s, I think, and 70s. And it's a reference to, central banks, pulling away the punch bowl when stock markets and debt get out of hand, pulling away the punch bowl. I think we've had over 30 years of, actually, it hasn't been a punch bowl. It's been more like a swimming pool, and people have been partying and drinking in that swimming pool. They might even have the swimming pool filled with champagne. Who knows? And now they've got the job of the bond market is to drain away the swimming pool. It's been such a orgy of credit, and I'll show you what I mean. So let's start with some charts. First of all, the 10-year yield, which in 1981 topped almost at 16%. And one of the reasons why this 3% rate is so important that we've talked about, and I'll show you a shorter term chart here, so you can see that we've broken out completely in the 5-year chart here. We've broken through this 3% level. And why is this 3% level important? It's not because it's a number or round number. I've always said it's because it marks the first time since 1981 where a significant high in yields is not followed by a significantly higher high. So you've got a trend of falling yields, lower lows and lower highs. So you can see that in 2013, at the end of 2013, we went to around 303. And so that's why this 3% level is so important. And it was only this week, I would say, that we've definitively broken through that 3%, even though we've been above that, come back down to around 280, and now we're at 323. So I would safely say that we're now, we've broken that 30, well, it's a trend that lasted, I would say, over 35 years, 2016, 2017. We've broken that trend. And it looks like we're gonna see higher highs. And why is that so significant? Well, because with that trend that we had from 1981 to 2016, which is when we saw the bottom at around 132, July of 2016, that means money has become cheaper and cheaper and cheaper. What's that done? Well, that's allowed people to borrow more and more and more and indebt themselves even more and more and more. So now if you're going to have the opposite trend, it doesn't follow that people will be able to borrow more and more and more. It will follow that people will default more and more and more, in my opinion. And that's, I can't see it any other way. Even though right now things seem to be doing really great. The Dow is near an all-time high. Well, we broke it a few weeks ago, the January high. We're actually now back below it. But just look at the Dow chart. Look at when it actually started lifting off. It was just after 1981. They're in the mid-80s. And it coincides with the interest rates coming down. Let's look at something else. Let's look at the United States government debt. Well, in 1981, I think the government debt was just under $1 trillion. Look where it's now. Look where it was before 1981, how it flatlined. It really didn't grow exponentially as it has in the last 35, 36 years. Why is that? Well, those interest rates. So how are we going to carry all this debt? How are we going to even, because in the fiat money system, of course, which we've had, Nixon removed the gold anchor in 1971, so there's no limit to how much debt the system can create. How are we going to keep that going? Because that system only survives with more and more debt. You need more and more debt. It's not a sustainable system. So with interest rates, in my opinion, turning around now, it looks like it doesn't look good. If we hadn't gone off a sound money system, this wouldn't have been possible. Does this mean we're gonna come out on the other side with a sound money system? Maybe, hopefully, we'll have to see. So not only has the government accumulated a humongous amount of debt, so has the consumer. And this is right from the horse's mouth. Board of Governors of the Federal Reserve System. So I got, use the enemy to expose the enemy, so to speak. Look at this consumer credit outstanding, seasonally adjusted. From 1945, again, look at where it starts taking off, early 80s, mid 80s. And the gray lines are recessions. The 08 recession was a great recession, but look at the little correction this consumer credit had. It's nothing. Maybe we're going to see a huge correction that is necessary. Maybe we'll go back to the trend that we had prior to the early, the trend line from prior to that chart, taking off in the early to mid 80s. Who knows? So that's the consumer, right? This is also personal consumption expenditures, which is the consumer, the percentage of the consumption or the consumer activity in the economy. Look at that line there is even in the early 80s. That's when it starts moving higher. Prior to that, it looked like the average was just above 60, and now we are at above around 70%. And the Keynesians, they think that consumption is the be all for the economy, that we need to encourage consumption to keep things going, while the Austrians realize that to consume you have to produce. So production is just as important as consumption for the Austrians. But we've been conditioned to believe that consumption is the be all, and I think that's going to come to an end, that kind of philosophy. So let's look at the corporate debt. Well, corporate debt, same kind of story. I've got a story here from an article from the Gold Telegraph. Corporate debt to GDP higher than before the '08 crisis. So there you go, almost 46% of GDP. Again, look at to the early 80s. It never went above like 36 before that, and it had been growing since the early 50s. But look how it's taken off since the early 80s. Why? Well, it's all to do with the interest rates. If the interest rates seem to be reversing, if the trend of ever lower interest rates have ended, how are we going to keep this going? That's my question, and that's why I made this video. This is not advice. This is my opinion. You might decide that the U.S. economy is going to keep the plain sailing, reach a safe harbor, and you could be right, but the odds are not great, in my opinion. I think the odds are much higher that we are in a runaway train scenario, not only for the United States, but for the whole world. The US dollar has been the reserve currency of the world. It's been the engine for the whole world economy. If you enjoyed this video, please like, share it, subscribe to my channel if you haven't yet. You can also follow me on Steemit, DTube, and on Twitter. I wish you a great day, and I'll talk to you later. Take care. Bye.